This video covers the IGCSE Biology Objective 1.2.7 on the 2025 CAIE syllabus to explain that groups of organisms with more similar DNA share a recent common ancestor. So we've already talked about what a recent common ancestor means in a previous video. So if you need to, you can go back and check that out. But in this particular video, we're going to talk about how that looks according to DNA. So DNA can change. So here we have strips of DNA represented by the genes. So what happens is genes are a bunch of nucleotides, which I mentioned in the last video. So gene A is a certain number of genes that are a certain number of nucleotides that represent a certain gene. For maybe eye color. B represents a number of nucleotides that have a certain order that's going to represent another gene, maybe for skin color. I'm just making this up. So here we have 4 different copies of that original strip of DNA, the A through the L. And so we can see that the first one has a slightly different variation to the nucleotides, and that is represented by the lowercase a instead of an uppercase A. The second one, the gene represented by B and the gene represented by C have swapped places. So now there's a different order to the DNA. In the third one, the B has been removed completely. So again, now there's a different order to the DNA. In the last one, we see that the genes in B and C have been repeated. So now we have more information in that strand of DNA. So these changes in the order of the DNA are called mutations. Sometimes the change in the DNA will have no effect on the organism at all. So it will just pass that change on to its offspring and nothing. Sometimes this mutation may change the morphology or the anatomy of the organism. Now, the change in morphology or anatomy can be harmful, and maybe the species will die out, or that particular line of organisms will die out because they cannot survive with this new change in their environment. Or it could be beneficial, and the organism can thrive even better in their environment. So these changes, these mutations, can have a positive, a negative, or I would say a neutral effect on the offspring of that particular individual where the mutation has occurred. So what scientists do is they use this idea of this genetic mutation to compare DNA. And the idea is that the more bands of DNA that match means that the organisms are more closely related and have recent common ancestors. So in the previous video, we were looking at the bands and how wide they were comparing to another one. So we can see here that there are bands and they're wider depending on the segment that's being looked at. So the less bands of DNA that match means that the organisms are less related, less closely related, and they have a more distant common ancestor. So if we take a look at the DNA, a small section of the DNA bases between a human, a chimpanzee, and a macaque, again, we are looking at the order of the nucleotides, and there are 4 of them, and we call them by the first letter of their name, A, T, C, G. We can see where the similarities are for all 3, and those are the bands that are colored, and the ones that are not colored now are the ones where there are differences between all 3. So if we look at the white areas in the DNA, we can see that the human and the chimpanzee share those same nucleotide bases, whereas the macaque has something completely different in all of those areas. So what that tells us is that humans and chimpanzees are more closely related than humans, chimpanzees, and macaques based on their common DNA. So the strips of DNA between humans and chimps in this particular section are identical compared to the macaque, which makes sense because the macaque is a type of bird. It's a completely different type of vertebrate. So clearly that would make sense as far as being less closely related to both humans and chimpanzees.